Yeah. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to join us this evening. My name is Nkosi Lee. Moderating and co-hosting here with Cassie Taylor, and we are here on behalf of the Simsbury Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. And as you can see, this is our Simsbury Let's Talk, and our topic for this evening is for Black History Month. For me personally, we've been a part of the council for a good 2 years strong, and we did many of the Let's Talk through COVID, and so many of our discussions always happen via Zoom. And so we had the stream and online, some obviously with the Simsbury Public TV as well. And that being said, the library has always been a gracious host to the council. But this is our first time having the opportunity to do this in person, and so it is a testament perhaps to the faithfulness of the group, the hard work of the group, all the people that have been involved to make this happen. And so now here we are at this point being able to stand before you, and it is great because I believe we have more people in person than actually we would have if it the ones that we had in Zoom. And so that's what we're here to do. We've always had this position of let's talk, let's have a discussion, let's have dialogue. And the point was always to bring conversations perhaps that are that would not always be in the public eye. And so we thought about how we could handle that responsibility in the town of Simsbury and the surrounding greater Hartford area. So we've done topics on Black History Month before, we've done Latino Heritage Month, we've done AAPI, we've done LGBTQ plus. We have done a variety of topics in that Native American. I think that might have been our first one. Juneteenth Day, we've done a celebration here as well. But the point being that we were always able to do conversations and topics that would always promote conversation, promote discussion, and promote an exchange of knowledge and give a platform for people to express themselves. And so that's what we're still here to be able to do, because so much happens through the power of conversation. So it allows us to receive different viewpoints, to give some of our own personal opinions, but at the end of every discussion, there's always been a time for growth. And that's always been the main thing. How can we make ourselves better? How can we make the community better? And it always is going to happen through dialogue and through tough conversations as well. These are not easy discussions. I know I've been challenged very much in many of my own viewpoints and perhaps biases that I never knew that I had in a lot of our conversations. So it's allowed me to grow immensely. And I know this evening we're going to have another opportunity for growth as well. And so that's what we're talking about. It's a living witness to slavery. And it's a Simsbury resident sharing her powerful family story of enslavement and resilience. And so this is our Let's Talk for tonight. And that meaning Let's Talk, there will be an opportunity also for questions. So that's going to be part of the dialogue. So it's not necessarily just the presentation, but we would definitely like to have interaction, right? So anything of your own personal questions as you hear, we will have a microphone to go around, towards the end, and we'll be able to hopefully, have a nice question and answer time as well. There we go. And just about Black History Month, and this is just starting from the historian Dr. Carter G. Woodson and the prominent minister Jesse E. Moreland. And so they founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, and it was dedicated to researching and promoting achievements by Black Americans and other people of African descent. I noticed that picture on here for Negro History Week is the picture of Salem Poor, and he fired the shot in the Battle of Bunker Hill that killed the British Major John Pitcairn. And so I know that picture, and it's always part of the story that necessarily has not been told, and that was the big importance of Negro History Week, and then moving into what we call Black History Month, and especially with Carter G. Woodson, allowing a story to be told from a Black perspective, and that was always very important, and giving an opportunity for Black scholars to be heard, Black poets to be heard, Black artists to be heard, and then be able to participate and contribute to the culture of America, which is a country that has been the fortunes of America, African Americans and Africans, whoever we like to say, have been a major part in the building and affluence of this country. And so that is something that comes up also in discussion. And so we know, you may hear the saying, well, February is the shortest month, that's why it was chosen for Black History Month. And it was not, and we see the intention was because it had the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. So it was Black History Week, Negro History Week, and then it's been expanded into Black History Month. So it's not a conspiracy in that sense on why it's February. There was a reason behind February being chosen, but we also know, come to the part, I hope in 2023, that we could be able to say that African American history or Black history is a big component of American history. And I'm happy in that sense to live in a state where they're passing laws to make it mandatory to teach African American history and Latino history, when, a few, 1,000 miles away or so, they're trying to make laws to make it illegal to teach African American history. So you're talking about really trying to put a squash on diversity and the contributions of people in helping in this nation. So that being said, this is why we're here this evening. So I hope that you are ready to listen, ready to learn, and of course that you are ready to talk as well. So that being said, I'm gonna pass this over, and we're now going to hear from Cassie Taylor.
Hi, everybody. This is my youngest. His name is Charlie. All right, buddy, can you go sit with Daddy, please? No? Okay. He's going to sit up here and join me for a little bit.
All right.
So just to talk a little about myself, I usually don't qualify who I am or explain my identity to people, but I am Black and white biracial. My experience with that is that usually if I qualify it, I don't feel, I guess I should say, the need to defend my identity, but my experience is that people expect me to. People have opinions because I obviously look very white. My mother is third generation Irish, full Irish in America. And my father, his family has historically identified as Black. And we are really a mixed race family. A lot of that goes back, unfortunately, go see Daddy, to the realities of the things that have happened to Black people in America with enslavement, a lot of the traumas that have existed. And also something that I'm going to talk about is the one drop rule. And my family has been defined historically by the one drop rule, which I think you all know, but if you don't, is if you had back in colonial America 1 drop of Black blood, you were Black. That was used obviously to oppress people, to reinforce white supremacy. For me, though, in being Black biracial, I think it's important to say that Blackness isn't, or whiteness, just your race isn't a percent or your skin color. It has to do with your history, your personal experiences, your culture. And so today I'll talk a bit about that, about my family history, and In doing so, you're going to hear, oh, well, let me back up. Well, I'm still talking about biracial identity. This right here is my father's father, my grandfather. And he met James Baldwin when he was the executive director of the American Society of African Culture. He met him in Paris. And James Baldwin actually talked about in his essay, Princes and Powers, meeting my grandfather, who led a delegation there from the United States. And I feel like this is an important quote. It says, the chief of the delegation, John Davis, was to be asked just why he considered himself a Negro. He was to be told that he certainly did not look like one. He is a Negro, of course, from the remarkable legal point of view which obtains in the United States, but more importantly, as he tried to make clear to his interlocutor, he was a Negro by choice and by depth of involvement, by experience and fact. So my grandfather grew up in Black neighborhoods. His dad looked Black. He had an older brother who looked Black, is very similar to my family, and another sister who looked white. His mother was also biracial, but she looked white. And so my grandfather got questioned on his race a lot. And, but he was very involved in his community. He was very involved in the culture. And I think that's, I guess, the point when I talk about being biracial. It's people make judgments based on if you're Black enough or you're white enough, the way you look. But it's more than that. It's your experience, it's your family history, it's your trauma, and it's your culture and how you're brought up in the culture. So being biracial, especially once you hear my family story, I think you'll understand why it's such a big part of my identity and who I am. And this just goes back to, again, the one drop rule. This is from a book that is, I really enjoy. It's by Dr. Yaba Blay. She interviews in it a bunch of different people with mixed identities and asks them about how they identify. And this is how historically in the colonial South, we have identified people of mixed ancestry. And actually, it's interesting because this is in colonial South, but my father has on his birth certificate printed that he's mulatto. So he was born in 1941. That wasn't too long ago, and we were still identifying people like that. So we started out when I'm a volunteer with the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. And when we started talking about this, it was because I had told them the story of the Edmondson family, which you will hear today. But in planning this out, other family stories came up, and we felt they were important to include. So you will hear those as well. And the themes are really going to be, you're going to hear stories of enslavement. You're going to hear about my family trauma, and I imagine you'll hear about how some of that still impacts us today. Adversity, racism, there's important American history that my family is tied to because my dad's family has been in DC for generations. And most importantly, you're going to hear stories of perseverance, of determination, of Black brilliance, of hope, success, resilience. In my family, some of you might think, oh, wow, these stories are just like incredible. And I'm not saying that they're not, they are. But there are so many other families out there with stories like mine that don't get told. And kind of like Nkosi was saying about, you know, it's great that we live in a state that has these laws that they're making to ensure that Black history is told and Latino history is told. It's so important, and we need more of that because we are missing some real American history that puts the world in context. And we have to keep telling the real history to understand the world in which we live. So again, the point is there are a lot of hidden figures out there, like the movie. So many stories that aren't told. And my family is just an example of one of many families across the United States. So the first story that I was going to tell goes all the way back to colonial America. with the Carter plantation. I am speaking of the realities and why I am a mixed race American, and the realities of enslavement goes back to the Carter plantation. I am a descendant of Robert King Carter, who was like the wealthiest man in colonial Virginia, if not all of the colonies. He acquired about, 300,000 almost acres of land, right? And we were talking about that the other day, like, what does even 300,000 acres of land look like?
What does that look like? Yes.
Yeah. And it's, we figured maybe Farmington Valley, because it was much bigger than Simsbury. We know that. And he was rather ruthless in how he accumulated it. He once sued the estate of a man that committed suicide based on the fact that he committed suicide, and saying he deserves all of his property and his land. He has ties to the British royalty in his lines, and nobility. His son, Robert Carter II, married a Churchill. So again, these are powerful, powerful people in colonial America. And Robert Carter II is actually the one who had a child with an enslaved woman named Mary, who is one of my descendants. And they had a man named, he's known as Baptist Billy and Black Brother Will by his brother, Robert Carter III. So when Robert Carter III was 3 months old, just to kind of give you an idea of the family again, Robert Carter I gifted him his first slave at 3 months old, which is just kind of crazy, because then you learn that his father dies when he's 4, and 6 months later, his grandfather dies, and Robert Carter III became the heir of the estate. There were multiple plantations. Nominee Hall was the big one there. And he grows up knowing that my ancestor, Will, was his half brother, and constantly refers to him as my Black brother Will. And so I think that opportunity, there was an opportunity there in having his father die when he was young, and his grandfather, because he was able to forge a relationship with his brother Will, who was about 3 years older than him. He was 7. And they became super close. He made Will like his confidant, and would send him on errands to go draft legal documents, to collect the rent from the white people who lived on the plantation. He gave him a bunch of very important tasks. And Will was also known as Baptist Billy, and Robert Carter had a religious conversion in his life, which greatly impacted his kind of feeling on slaves and enslavement. And he decided, through his relationship with his brother and his Baptist faith, that he was going to free all of the people who were enslaved on this property. And this is a man, by the way, who was friends with Thomas Jefferson. I believe he had loaned Jefferson money, knew Washington, knew all the power players in colonial America. And they all said, don't do it. You're crazy. Like, yes, Jefferson, yeah, you should totally, people shouldn't be enslaved, but don't do this. You're crazy. Because, they had so much land and so much wealth. And he was willing to just like, nope, this is wrong. I'm gonna give it up. And the reason I bring all this up isn't really to give Robert Carter III all of this praise, because there were other things about him where he didn't do this deed of gift until the end of his life. So he still kept everybody enslaved until then. And he also didn't like the way enslaved people were treated, but he's noted in some of his writings that, this isn't good, but it's kind of necessary to make sure that they do their job. So while he wasn't going to hurt anybody who was enslaved, he hired slave masters and let them do the work. So, there's still blood on his hands there, in my opinion. The incredible thing and the hero of the story to me is Billy. Because Billy was a guy who forged a strong relationship with his half-brother, strong enough that it had an impact on his brother to rethink slavery on top of his religion, the impact of the religion as well. And it got him thinking, this is my brother, this is somebody I care about. Maybe this isn't that good of a thing to do. And so in the deed of gift, where he, Carter III, freed about roughly 500 slaves, give or take, he calls out specifically Billy in there and Billy's ancestors by name, which was really important because it once again showed the important relationship that he had with his brother and how that impacted his decision to do the greatest emancipation of slaves outside of the Civil War. So this is the biggest freeing of all slaves ever happened outside of the Civil War in the United States. So jumping, that's on my grandfather's line, the Burke family, and that goes to my grandfather's my grandfather's grandmother was from the Burke lines. We're now jumping to another side of my family, my grandmother's side of the family. And this is kind of the big story that kind of put tonight's talk in motion, and it has to do with the Edmondson family and a ship called the Pearl. The Edmondsons were a family they had 14 kids. And Paul Edmondson and Amelia, who went by Millie, were married, but Millie was enslaved and Paul was a free man. So we just talked about the Carters, right? Who they just passed all this wealth down their male lines. Well, if you were an enslaved person, your children, if you were a woman, would follow like the inheritance of your children are enslaved. So it's kind of like, I don't know if funny is a good word, but here we are, we pass wealth down to men, but when it came to enslavement, we followed the lines of the mother, which was used to enforce white supremacy. There's some misogyny in there, in my opinion, as well. Just a whole other set of rules to ensure that people could have more slaves. So they had 14 children, and all 14 children were enslaved because Millie, was enslaved. And Paul couldn't afford to buy his wife out of slavery, and he couldn't afford to buy all his kids. One of their kids, Elizabeth Edmondson, is my ancestor, and she married a gentleman named John Brent who was able to buy her freedom. And they lived in Washington, D.C., and they accumulated some wealth, and they were able to buy a house. And all of Elizabeth's siblings were what's considered house slaves in Washington, D.C. They had people who owned them, and they would rent them out to the Washington, D.C. elites. And there they served those families. And here's a little bit, it talks about the Edmondsons. So Samuel Edmondson is one of the kids, and he learns that there are some abolitionists and some other enslaved people who are planning this escape called the Pearl. And the schooner that the escape was going to be on is the Pearl. So the Pearl was a ship. It took 77 slaves out of the DC area with the goal of getting them to New Jersey, where they would be able to live freely. Involved in the planning was Garrett Smith, the famous abolitionist, the captain, Daniel, why am I forgetting? Drayton, there we go. There are a lot of names and there's a lot of historical figures, so please excuse me if my mind goes blank at some point. Daniel Drayton, and really what the abolitionists wanted is they wanted to create a big event that would make Congress take notice of what was happening with enslavement. I mean, they knew what was happening with enslavement, but really like light fire under them to try to get rid of slavery, and especially in DC. And Daniel Drayton had been a sailor, and he had said that you could ask any sailor at the time, they would tell you that like slavery, they really felt bad for those who were enslaved, because they were approached very often by people who had tried to gain their freedom, who were hiding in the woods for days, and they would approach these ships and say, hey, can you help me get north? And he often did that. He often tried to help those who were enslaved, and it never really worked out until one family, right before the Pearl, he was able to get a family to their freedom. And he's like, you know what? I want to try something bigger. I want to see if I can get more people. So he connected with Garrett Smith, who helped him raise some money to get the schooner, the Pearl. He also connected to an enslaved man named Paul Jennings, who had been enslaved by President Madison. And when President Madison died, Dolly Madison was in some financial trouble. She sold him for $200 to like a slave trade group, and they sold him to Senator Daniel Webster, who it's believed he had some interactions with Paul Jennings when he was serving President Madison. And Daniel Webster paid $120 for him and said, hey, I'm going to give you your freedom, but you have to pay me back for it. You owe me $8 a month until you are free and clear of the $120 I paid. And at the time of the Pearl, he still owed Senator Webster a considerable amount of money. So that was his motivation in being in on it, besides freeing other enslaved people. And he met Daniel Drayton because when he was with Webster, he often traveled with him. He had access to Webster's library. He was given a lot of freedom, basically, and kind of worked as Webster's right-hand man. And on a trip to Philadelphia is where he connected with Daniel Drayton. There's also a gentleman named Daniel Bell, whose family was very similar to mine. His wife and kids were enslaved, and they were actually freed by their owner in his will upon his death. But what happened is his wife then sued, trying to undo their freedom. And he was represented, he was in a court battle with her. It was costing him a lot of money. He was nervous he wasn't going to win, even though I read that most likely he would have won. And he was actually represented by somebody I'll talk about later, who is also an ancestor of mine. His name is James Manville Carlisle. And Carlisle actually, in the Pearl affair, also represented Daniel Drayton, the captain of the ship. So those two, along with the Edmondson family, were the enslaved people who were involved in the planning of the Pearl. There were 77 enslaved people that they tried to bring north. And the night of the escape, one of the people on the that was going on the Pearl took like a taxi to get there. And the driver was a man by the name of Judson Diggs. And Judson Diggs was Black, and he knew the Edmondson family. He had been at their home many times. He'd actually proposed to Emily Edmondson, and she laughed in his face at the proposal and rejected him. And when he dropped off this one person to the meeting point for the Pearl, the person said, hey, I don't have any money on me right now. I'm really sorry, but I'll send money to you, I promise. And so Judson Diggs had a chip on his shoulder for two reasons. One is Emily Edmondson, one of the 6 Edmondson children who was on the Pearl, had rejected his proposal, and also the not being paid the fare. So when the Pearl leaves, they run into basically a storm. They leave, they're on the Potomac, they're heading out, trying to get to Chesapeake Bay, and a storm hits, and it's just a little schooner, it's small, and there were like 2 captains. There's the Captain Sayre is like, hey, we're not gonna make it. We gotta go hide somewhere. So they go to Cornfield Harbor and they try to hide the ships there and just hope they can make it out. You know, nobody will see them. They can make it out in the morning. In the morning, everybody wakes up. Why don't I have breakfast ready and waiting for me? Wait, why is the baby crying? Why aren't the fires lit? Everybody realizes that the enslaved people serving them are gone. And a whole mob gets together and tries to go find them. And they're in search of them, and they encounter Judson Diggs, who says, hey, they all went and escaped. You go look down the Potomac and you'll find them. And they do find them. And unfortunately, of course, all the owners were very upset, and a mob forms. They have riots over the situation in Washington, D.C., and they sold, all the 77 people were sold by their slave owners to like a slave trading group in Alexandria, and that group planned to send them all south. Now, the thing about everybody being in Washington, D.C., again, they were house slaves. And so that was supposed to be like a cushy job if you were working in a house. You're considered to be more well-educated, you have freedoms. The Edmondson family, for example, they would often go and meet in DC at the house of Elizabeth Edmondson Brent and her husband, John Brent. And that's where they did a lot of the planning for the Pearl, is every week they would go and the family would get together and they would plan all this. So they had freedoms in that. And I think with the abolitionist movement, a lot of people had to wake up like, oh, wow, you're saying these were house slaves that tried to escape? Like they had it good, and they felt that they need to escape all of that. And I mean, well, yeah, imagine, and many of you, I'm assuming, are parents out there. Imagine like your children can be ripped away from you at any second. Like Daniel Bell and my family, they didn't want to break up their kids. They didn't want to lose their kids, and their kids could be sold at a moment's notice and be sent somewhere else, like down south. And down south, the conditions were not good because those slaves were working on plantations there. And in the case of the Edmondsons, and Mary and Emily Edmondson were the only 2 female Edmondsons out of the 6 of them that were on the Pearl. They were the youngest on the Pearl. There were 13 and 15 at the time. And they were going to be sold at a fancy girl market, which fancy girl market means prostitution. They were going to be sold essentially as prostitutes after they were captured. Paul Edmondson does whatever he can to, raise money and funds for his kids, and gets a lot of help from the abolitionist movement, specifically from the Beecher Stowe family, because, is that on the next slide? No. The Beecher Stowes, had a congregation in New York, and they helped raise a bunch of the money so that they could buy the freedom of the Edmondson sisters. And Harriet Beecher Stowe becomes really good friends with Emily and Mary Edmondson, and to the point that she mentions and writes about the Pearl incident specifically in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And when she references slaves being sold down south in the deep south and not wanting to go there, that comes from the Pearl. So the Pearl actually inspired a lot of Uncle Tom's Cabin and was written in there. And the Beecher Stows were fantastic in that their congregation also helped pay for Mary and Emily to go to college at Oberlin College and paid for their education. Unfortunately, Mary passes away at age 20 at a young age of tuberculosis, but Emily goes on and gets her education, teaches at the normal school for black, is it black girls, or I forget what they, black girls or colored girls is what they called it, and became a face on the abolitionist movement. Here she is in, I think back at the beginning, here we go. Here she is with Frederick Douglass. I believe that's her right there, speaking at a convention together. That's my son. So really, the big thing about the Pearl is the Pearl was a big event that got everybody riled up, from the abolitionist movement to those who were pro-slavery. And it did do what the abolitionists like Garrett Smith wanted. It got people's attention in Congress. I mean, this was many of them. It was their slaves that were missing in the morning. And so it is credited as being one of the big final catalysts for the Civil War, because it really woke a lot of people up and it got a lot of people riled up. At the same time as the Edmondsons are in Washington, D.C., and on these same lines, my grandma's lines in the family, there is a gentleman by the name of James Wormley. He is a free black man. See, my son over here is getting really excited because he knows a lot about James Wormley. James was born to Lynch Wormley and Polly Wormley, and Lynch was described as quite dark with straight hair, and Polly is described as almost white. Apparently, she may be a cousin of actually Dolly Madison's, as interesting as that is. And they moved to Washington, D.C., and because of Dolly's connections to the Madison family, they had a great social network, which they utilized and they leveraged. And they were able to eventually start a livery stable in DC, where they were the drivers for some of Washington, DC's most elite, most powerful people. And their oldest son, James, was one of those drivers who not only was a very skilled driver because he'd been a jockey as well, but he was also really valued because a lot of powerful men were having very important conversations while he was driving them, and they really appreciated his discretion. So he inherited from his parents his ability to network. And in doing that, he was able to basically raise some money, and he started a catering business, and many of those people started going to him for their catering needs. And then he started a boarding house, which turned into the Wormley Hotel. And the Wormley Hotel is where everyone who was anyone went. Charles Sumner, he was good friends with Frederick Douglass, who would often go to the hotel. There are rumors, they're unsubstantiated, that that's where Lincoln actually died and that he was at his bedside when he passed away. But I haven't found anything that says, yes, this definitely happened. It's just a rumor that this may have been where he passed away. I'm trying to think of Thomas Edison as another one. And the Compromise of 1877 is the event that basically decided the Tilden-Hayes election. And that happened at the Wormley Hotel. And so that's, it's also known as the Wormley Agreement because of this. And this is a free black man who owned the hotel in Washington, D.C. during the Civil War era and right around there. And I mean, that's just an incredible thing that a black man in that time in American history owns such a place of prominence and importance. A little bit more about it. Now, the hotel ended up getting sold eventually. The end of Reconstruction played a part in that, and the financial crisis. And then hotels like the Sheraton came into DC around the same time. This talks about some of the other things that happened there. Interestingly enough, side note, I noted it there. The agreement of 1877, while it gave Hayes the election, it also signified the end of troops from being in the South, which is kind of interesting that happened at a black man's hotel. Senator Daniel Webster was a good friend of his. And also Garrett Smith, there's that name again. He actually named one of his sons, Garrett Smith Wormley, who is my ancestor as well, after Garrett Smith, because they were close friends. He used his prominence and his wealth to try to do good for his community. He worked with Charles Sumner to get legislation passed to fund the first public schools for Black Americans in Washington, D.C. And in 1885, the Wormley Elementary School for the Colored was erected in his honor. And a lot of his descendants, including my great-grandfather, went on to work in education. My great-grandfather was a principal. So it's pretty cool. You can go to Washington, D.C. When the hotel was sold, it became a bank, and then eventually it was torn down, so it's no longer there. But there is a marker there where the hotel used to stand. And you can go to the Smithsonian. They actually have plates and pieces related to the Wormley Hotel in Washington, D.C. So that's on my grandma's lines. And then we jump back to my grandfather's lines. And I think you remember I talked about James Manville Carlisle, who was the lawyer for Daniel Drayton and for the enslaved man Daniel Bell and his family. And he is my great-great-grandfather. He was a very powerful attorney in Washington, D.C., and he was white. And he was president of the bar, legal counsel for Colombia and Spain. I didn't put this on here, but he was also an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. And he was married twice. His first wife passed away. And in between his two marriages, he fathered a child with his black maid, who is my great-great-grandmother. They had my great-grandfather, John Abraham Davis. It's a questionable relationship, right? Even though he's an abolitionist, you're talking about a man who had a child with his employee, and a black employee at that. He also, even though he was an abolitionist, he offered to pay my great-grandfather's education and to help him financially, but he would not acknowledge him publicly. And this is a picture of the Davis family that I accidentally clicked on, and I'll get there. So this man right here was his son with Carolyn Gaskins, Davis Chin. So my last name should really be Carlisle. Davis was a married name of Carolyn Gaskins. She married twice. And so he took the name of his mother at the time. And that's how my maiden name became Davis. And she was quite incredible, by the way. She was apparently the first black woman to hold a white-collar job in Washington, D.C. She had a number of properties, including a family farm that she was able to pass on to my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather was a brilliant man. He was a valedictorian of M Street School, which was later known as Dunbar School. And does anybody here know of Dunbar? Dunbar, there are a number of famous, wonderful African Americans, including Woodson, who founded Black History Month, who graduated from Dunbar and taught at Dunbar, it was known as the place for African Americans to be educated, because at the time, you would have some I believe the principal actually graduated from Harvard, if I remember. Or maybe was the first Black woman, maybe it wasn't Harvard, maybe she was the first Black woman to get a college degree. But you had these well-educated African Americans, but because of Jim Crow, they didn't have any places to really teach. Universities didn't want to hire them on, so they all worked at Dunbar. And Dunbar produced just a lot of really great alum. So he went to what became Dunbar and was a valedictorian. He inherited the family farm in Virginia, acquired several properties, and he rose in prominence at work at the government printing office. One of the ways he did that is the same way the Wormleys were able to acquire the wealth and do as well as they did. He worked the system, he networked. Senator William Boyd Allison was kind of like a patron of his, he formed a relationship with him, and Senator Allison would go and write letters to his bosses saying, hey, you really need to consider John for promotion, and it kind of put pressure on his bosses, and it helped him rise in the system. He went from, when he started at the beginning of his career, he was making 25 cents an hour, about $500 a year. And then 30 years later, he was making somewhere between $1,400 and $1,800 a year, and became a supervisor overseeing, I believe it was 9 white workers below him. So he's a Black man overseeing a bunch of white workers. So then Woodrow Wilson was elected president. And if you know anything about Woodrow Wilson, he was a racist. And he instilled in the US government a lot of Jim Crow policies that led to the demotion of many Black workers. Statistically, wages suffered for Black workers in government. And it was pretty much immediately felt for my great-grandfather. Within a year of Wilson being elected and entering office, he was demoted back to the wage that he had started at 25 cents an hour. And all the properties my family had owned, so we had all this wealth, right? We had a huge farm in Virginia. It was the biggest in Prince County. And we also had a number of homes in Washington, D.C. that they were all mortgaged, but family members lived in those other Black family members. And he basically, sorry, I'm losing my spot in my brain again here. They were mortgaged, and the Black family members, he didn't rent them out to his family in terms of like, I'm going to try to make money off of my family and be a landlord and make this be profitable. No, he basically just was like, hey, you guys can live here. Yeah, pay me some rent, but I'm not making money off of it. I just, just enough to keep the homes. Well, he had to sell all of those homes except for one, which the family kept and lived in. And he sold the farm, and that was the biggest blow to him because that farm had been inherited from his mother. He sold it at a discount. He did a fire sale because he risked losing it completely otherwise. He had tried to go to the bank for a loan. The bank wouldn't give him a loan because he was a Black man. The KKK chased his workers off the land too. He kind of had a mark on his back already because he was a very proud Black man who was one of the founders of the NAACP chapter in Washington, D.C. He registered to vote in his area, and he was a very proud, big fan of like Teddy Roosevelt, and he registered to vote and voted there, and so all the white Southerners were really upset with him already. So yeah, KKK chased all his workers off of his land, and he couldn't afford to keep it. So he went from being what was known as the black bourgeoisie. He was very successful, had land, had homes, to losing essentially everything. What was the hardest thing for him was losing the position in life, especially at work that he'd worked so hard to attain. And it really was felt by the family, the entire family. His oldest son, Allison, who is named after, William Boyd Allison, went on to become a famous anthropologist. I'll talk about him in a moment. He wrote about what that was like growing up, about his father losing everything and how the impact that had on the family. And he actually, at age 11, had to start working as an elevator boy in honor to, to bring in money for the family and to help support his family at age 11. And the family had to take in boarders too. And many of those boarders were the family members that they had to kick out of the homes. So it was like a whole community that suffered. It wasn't just my family, it was the people that were living in the homes that we owned, because of what happened with Jim Crow and Woodrow Wilson's policies. So this is the family at the farm. Right there, that was John Abraham Davis. This is my Uncle Allison, my Aunt Dot. She was white presenting. This was my great-grandmother, Gabrielle. The sale of the farm and what happened to my great-grandfather to this day is trauma that is so felt in my family. This picture right here of the public sale hangs in my parents' dining room. And my family talks about all the time, like, we should own a farm in Virginia that was stolen from us. And it reminds me, you hear stories, it was just in the news of the family in, there have been multiple stories. There was one in Chicago, but there was one in Los Angeles who had their land, beach land, taken from them. And finally, they just got it back. And I believe they're now selling it back to Los Angeles for millions of dollars. But like, these sorts of things happen to Black people often, especially in Jim Crow America. Their wealth, our opportunities to build generational wealth, was taken from us. So this, like I said, is still talked about. There's actually an article online. You can Google it. It said, "What Woodrow Wilson Cost My Grandfather." It was written by my cousin Gordon. It was in the New York Times when Princeton was considering removing Wilson's name from their buildings and their programs. And it tells the same story of what happened. He died at age 66. And my family very much credits that to, he ended up having to work as a messenger in the War Department and do a lot more physical labor. And then also his broken spirit once he lost everything, because he never got it back. But what he and my great-grandmother did really well is they pushed education to their children and the importance of education and working really, really hard. Hi, baby. Working really, really hard and persevering. And so they had 3 children. They had Dr. William Allison Davis, who is my great uncle, and he also became a valedictorian at Dunbar School. And Dunbar had a relationship with Williams College, that their valedictorian would get to go to Williams on a full ride. And so Allison went to Williams on a full ride. And then he went on to Harvard, and he got 2 degrees at Harvard. And then he went to the University of Chicago, and he became a pioneer in anthropology. And he did the biggest study on caste in America. He went down to the Deep South to Mississippi with 2 white researchers and and it was him and his wife, and then another Black researcher as well, St. Clair Drake. And they lived in the community undercover, studying caste and what it was like to live as white people and Black people, and how you interact, and the different even class levels within those communities. It was very risky. Had white people found out what would happen, I mean, there were lynchings happening all the time, so his life would have been at risk. Especially, they would have balked at the fact that he was the head researcher on this, a Black man was. He kept a gun in his car for his safety and his wife's safety. Has anybody read the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson? There is a chapter on my great uncle in caste, if you ever, yeah. So because of the work that he did was so groundbreaking and important, and speaks to how this country is built. Caste is a great book because it breaks it down and explains how white supremacy is really just built into our country, and it describes it as like America as like a house, and it was built into our foundation, and that's why a lot of the issues and the systems that we have still exist. Our country was built to reinforce that structure, basically, and the laws were built to reinforce this caste system. He also dedicated a lot of his work to education, and he debunked the whole theory that, Black people just aren't as smart, lower income people aren't as smart, and show that the bias in standardized testing. And his studies on education became the basis for Head Start and affirmative action as well. He has his own Black History Month stamp because of his work that was so crucial. And it was also used in Brown versus the Board of Education by his brother, my grandfather, who I adored and was the most wonderful grandfather in the world, John Aubrey Davis Sr. He was the youngest of the kids. His father died when he was 16 years old. He knew a very different life than his brother Allison. By the way, Allison was dark. My grandfather looked like me. I very much looked like my grandfather. And that very much impacted why Allison went the way he did, because growing up, he had a lot of experiences where he had to sit on the back of a train with his father who looked Black, and the people who worked on the train, the porters, would be like no to my grandfather and their mom and our Aunt Dot and say, you need to sit elsewhere because you guys are white. And they would be like, no, we're Black. And Allison had a lot of issues because of that. Being told that, he had to sit in the back, and his mother their mother used to bring him shopping on Saturdays. And it sounds like my great grandmother was a real pistol, and she would bring him into these white stores because she was white assumed, which is what people say passing. I like to say white assumed because they weren't trying to pass. And the salespeople would be like, well, why is this Black child in here? And she would rip them a new one and say, that child's my son. He's going to be in here. You're going to have to deal. But it was very hard on Allison. And that's why he went the way he did and studied caste and wanted to debunk a lot of the things with Black intelligence, and class became an issue to him because he was born in a time in the family. He was like 11 years older than my grandfather when they had everything and saw it all taken away. My grandfather was born in 1912, and a year later is when his father lost everything. And so he only knew a life of, we don't have anything. And he grew up, they both grew up in Washington, D.C., not far from Howard. And when he also graduated Williams and graduated top of his class from Dunbar. And after he graduated Williams, he went back home to DC, and he noticed that the Depression had just happened, and lots of Black workers were being fired at, the first place was called the Hamburger Grill. So it's in a Black neighborhood, and the workers that were Black there were being fired, and white workers were being hired. And he started the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaign as a result. And they put pressure on the business and other businesses eventually, because the first one was successful, through picketing and flyers to fire the white workers and rehire the Black workers. And with the Hamburger Grill, it was successful. Within a matter of days, they had rehired the Black workers at higher wages, and they could work less hours. And so he was able to start the New Negro Alliance. A lot of people, prominent people in DC, got involved. Ralph Bunche, actually, it caught his attention. He was a professor at Howard, and he was the first Black man to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he showed up to the meetings even to find out what was going on. And he actually was so impressed with my grandfather, he spent an evening trying to convince him to go into political science, which he did. My grandfather was originally interested in going into English. Anyway, eventually they start picketing all of these businesses, including some that are run by Sanitary Grocery Company, which is known today as Safeway. They get mad and they sue the New Negro Alliance. And one of the founders with my grandfather, Bedford, I believe, Lawson Bedford, I think was his, or Bedford Lawson. He, anyway, was a lawyer, and he represented the New Negro Alliance, and the NAACP got involved, and they also had a lawyer that became an assistant lawyer on the case as it made its way up to the Supreme Court, and his name was Thurgood Marshall. And my grandfather actually met Thurgood Marshall through that, and the two became best friends. They won in the Supreme Court. You can look up the case, New Negro Alliance versus Sanitary Grocery Company, and that ruling affirms our right to picket in the United States businesses. So then Marshall, eventually, my grandfather and Thurgood Marshall formed such a strong relationship that he gets Brown versus the Board of Education handed to him. And he asked my grandfather, to become the head academic research and head up the team that formed the arguments for him, that had all the research for the arguments he would make for the case. And that's where he used his brother, Allison Davis's research, and why the intelligence testing became such an important point. I'm very grateful to my grandfather because my father, his own son, they moved from DC to New York when my father was in high school, and my father couldn't read well. And that's because he'd gone to really poor public schools. I believe at that point, somewhere along the line, Dunbar was no longer as great as it used to be. And I don't think my father went to Dunbar, but basically he wasn't getting that great of an education. And we look the way we do, and if we lived in a world where segregation was still legal, I would have had to have gone to a segregated school. I would not be as well educated if my grandfather and his friends didn't fight to end segregation in schools. So I realized that he was doing this for everybody, but he profoundly impacted my life and my kids' lives because, again, one drop rule in America that would have said, like, oh, sorry, she needs to go to a segregated school. Her kids need to go to segregated schools. Again, in DC, you can find this. It just marks the protests here. That this is on the literature that they would pass out. And here are some historic pictures related to the protests and what people were wearing when they were picketing. My grandmother is Mavis Wormley Davis. Again, she was in Edmondson and a Wormley. Just to kind of sum up with my family and how we are now and everything that we've overcome. Grandma was well educated, became a library scientist. Her mother, Mamie Cheatham Wormley, was also impressive. She was the daughter of one of only 5 Black U.S. congressmen from the South, from North Carolina, elected during Jim Crow. And she's also the niece of George Henry White, who, remember the anti-lynching bill that just went into law last year? Well, he was the first one to propose it back in 1900. It took 122 years. But he was the U.S. congressman, a Black U.S. congressman, who originally introduced the anti-lynching bill. But actually, Thurgood Marshall, this is a picture of them at their 50th wedding anniversary, which is crazy because I was a little girl and everybody's like, oh, come meet your, grandfather's friend here. And I'm like, oh, hi. And he's like, oh, you're a cute little kid. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is great. This is just another one of my grandparents' friends that thinks I'm cute, whatever. And then you grow up and you realize, oh my God, I met Thurgood Marshall as a little kid and I had no idea. So that's a picture of them there. He, after they won Brown versus the Board of Education, gave my grandmother a signed brief that's at my uncle's house of the ruling, saying, thank you for giving us John, and crediting her in it. I forget that the exact words were like, basically, this is as much like we won as much because of you as like, the work that your husband did, which I think is important piece of this is that he realized her contributions. Anyway, grandma became a library scientist. She was published in her own right, a brilliant woman. Her mother worked in the Japanese internment camps in Arizona as a social worker. She was a Wormley, so education was very important to them. Her brother worked as a physician in the Japanese internment camps in Arizona. I'm originally from Arizona. That's kind of how we made our way out there. Edith, her sister, taught as a teacher on the Native American reservation, and my father, who was greatly influenced by his mother's family, made his way out to Arizona. Part of the reason is he wanted to leave New York because of racism he was facing. My father was rejected, just to give you a little background, from every white med school except for Howard. So my father went to Howard for med school because that was his only opportunity. No white school wanted him, despite having a Williams education himself. And he faced racism in his career in New York City, which is where he met my mother. She was an RN. And he also went on to work with indigenous populations through it's called Indian Health Services. And we forced him to retire in 2020 when COVID hit, which it was about time. But speaking of family trauma, is my father always grew up feeling like anything could be taken from you at any moment. And again, he has sitting in the house that bill of sale from losing the farm, or the advertisement for it. And I know he inherited that feeling from his father because, again, I heard that growing up, my dad would say, oh, we had to eat ketchup sandwiches. And talking to other members of the family, they're like, oh, no, your grandfather's, he had money. He had, and I know he did because my sisters and I and my cousins, we were all left trust funds when he passed away. But my father grew up feeling like he was poor. He had to eat ketchup sandwiches. They didn't have much wealth because of this mentality that existed because everything was taken away from my family. But through their resilience, their brilliance, and their hard work, they were able to persevere to the point of everything that my great uncle accomplished, everything my grandfather accomplished. And my dad became an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. And his brother was a managing partner at Aiken Gump in DC until he retired. So they went on to do wonderful, wonderful, great things. And I think that's the biggest thing in celebrating and honoring my family's achievements. These are just slides of places that we've gone and that we remember. This is my grandfather, by the way, from when his father founded the DC chapter of the NAACP. This is in the Smithsonian, and this is the Wormley plate in the Smithsonian. But I think the biggest thing about all this is I am so impressed by the people in my family. They've encountered enslavement. They've encountered rape and trauma. They've had their family split up and threatened to be split up. They have had Jim Crow take away their job, take away their homes, take away their lands. You know, and this is just those things, not to mention the things that I know my family has gone through today that are traumatic that I won't get into, aside from my father being rejected by med schools and other, there are other racist issues that my father, my sister, and even I have encountered looking the way I do, because I have found that when people find out that I am part Black, not everybody treats me the same, unfortunately. But there has been this resilience that we're going to persevere and we're going to push through and we're going to make things happen for ourselves, and they have. And they've made my life better, and they've made the lives of, frankly, countless other people in this country better because of it all. And then this is caste. This is the, you know, the deed freeing all the slaves. This is the Brown versus Board of Education brief. Oh, Williams College now has the Davis Center, which is their multicultural center. That's my dad. Over a decade ago, when they named it in honor of my grandfather and my great uncle. But again, my family has been all through all of these things, but I'm just one family. And I know there are so many other families out there that have stories, multiple stories like mine. And Kosi and I were talking about Roots, for example. I mean, that's Alex Haley's family. You have the movie Hidden Figures. You have so many. These are just like stories you don't hear about a lot, and you wouldn't hear about a lot if people, you know, with Hidden Figures, I think she told the story to her neighbor, who just happened to be somebody who was in a position where she could write a book and they could get a movie. And, you know, there are so many stories like that out there that aren't told, which is why it's so important to honor Black History Month and tell the stories in Black History Month and celebrate all of the things that Black Americans have done to make this country better and to make our lives better, because they have. They are the stories of America. They are the stories of our country, of our founding, of the things that we've done since then to change laws and to just create a place that's more innovative and better, and where there's more hope. So in telling the story of my family, I celebrate all Black people who have fought and continue to fight to make this world and country a better place and to overcome adverse circumstances. I hope you all will also do the same and to seek out Black stories. There's some great websites like blackpast.org, even some Instagrams out there that tell stories that you don't usually hear. And I really encourage you to seek those out, and to, especially during Black History Month.
Open up for questions, and I just wanted to add, perhaps, you know, as a social studies teacher and historians, like there's so many stories or pieces of history that feed off of what we were able to hear tonight that and just hearing the part of one of your ancestors, you said it was a jockey. And then hearing that, it made me think of how like over 50% of the first Kentucky Derby winners were black jockeys.
Yeah.
But the fact that they were making so much money winning the Derby, it became outlawed, as far as them being able to be in that race. Quite a few things. The Baptists in your family, many of those emigrated to Jamaica.
Yeah.
And started a multitude of rebellions, in Jamaica. Sam Sharp with the Baptist Rebellion, but there's so much information that feeds off of that speaks of African American history, American history, and then giving also a worldwide impact. And so be able to perhaps say a little bit more, but we want to do is open the floor for questions or any comments perhaps that you might have just from being able to hear and watch all this information and all these stories that were just shared with us. We have a microphone, so it's gonna go. I think. Oh, there we go. There we go. Do you need the microphone?
You mentioned the word trauma, and in the early days of this group getting together, that's the word I put out, like underlying. It goes beyond the color of our skins and what we see with our eyes. It's the trauma, the generational trauma that everybody's carrying. I'm curious and I'm sickened by the fact that your family legitimately built success, and the hate, almost like rubbing their faces in it, it had to be ripped away from them. And I'm disgusted by that. I'm curious, when you said your great-grandmother had accumulated wealth, had gotten the family farm. Mm-hmm. Was that her family farm, or was that the farm of the father who would not acknowledge her son?
It was her family's farm. So she's actually, again, we're a mixed race family for generations. There's a gentleman named John Brazier Cannon, who was apparently her father, and he was white. I actually have his diary from Mount Vernon. He worked there for the Washingtons for a while, and it was passed down to her from him. I believe it was his brother's, and then he inherited it from his brother because his brother had been very successful. And that was all lost. Thank you.
So I assume that Gordon Davis is your great uncle or your uncle?
He's my dad's cousin, Gordon Davis. That's who you said, Gordon
Yes,
Davis?
yes.
Yeah. Gordon Davis is my dad's first cousin. He's like an uncle to me.
He's another Eve. He's another Williams grad.
I'm sorry, I'm hearing him.
He's another Williams grad as well.
Yes, he is another Williams.
He
grad.
worked under Ed Koch as the Parks Commissioner for many
Yes.
years. Yes.
Yes, he's wonderful.
Yeah.
He's Venable, I think, is his law firm. And,
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Very loyal alum.
Yeah.
I was just amazed at the intricacy of some of the laws that you started off with, explaining all of the different quarter and 3/4 and 1/8. And do you have any idea how those laws came about, where they came from, what sort of was it something that just gradually developed, or was it something that was initiated by the government?
I'm not sure. Do you know how
Well, because it mentioned Louisiana.
Yeah.
And so it was under French control. And so if you know, with the French involved in slavery, especially in the colony of Saint Domingue, there was, some would tell you nearly 100 different categories of color. So the whole caste system, was based on that that color
So that was very,
system.
very old. It was a very old system.
Correct. And that was created caste A within the black community, and how if you're black, how you're able to interact with people from the white community as well. So your whole your access almost would either increase or decrease. Obviously, the more black blood that you had versus the less black blood. So I think it started as fully black, and I think it went down to maybe like 1/16, you know, if I'm not mistaken. But a lot of that came from French society, especially when you see it was in Louisiana as well. And so a lot of those laws came with how your where you would fit in the caste system, especially in the French colonies.
Were those also including the Native Americans? Did they have a similar system, or were they included in the system?
I think the blood quantum, is that what you're talking about? I believe that was done as a means of like controlling who could belong by the U.S. government, because I could be wrong. I don't know enough about it, but what the U.S. government owed maybe people in the native indigenous communities, but I don't know enough about it. I have to be honest.
Thank you.
No problem.
No, just to add with that was the caste system also was in Spanish
Yeah.
colonies as well. So the natives from Latin American countries were subject to the exact same treatment based also what they call mestizo as well. So it was across the board depending on I guess you say where the action was taking place. It was Latin America, it was Native American.
Yes. Maroon, octoroon. I think that a lot of this in the United States, which is different than in the Caribbean, is our anxieties about racial mixing. And so, you would look like you, Cassie, but then you would be, if you got together, right, you would
Yeah.
produce children. Yeah. So I think that's a lot of where the anxiety comes. And well into the 20th century, in Georgia, if you were 1/64th black, you were black. 1/64th.
There's a lot of the titles are French.
Yeah, they are. Passé à blanc, exactly right.
Oh, I have a question about your research process. I'm curious if you have done most of this research and documentation yourself, or is it a combination of being stories passed down from your family, information given to you? What is the percentage of what you have found out, your family has told you? You just mentioned the diaries from Mount Vernon. So there's a lot of information here, and how did you cull it together?
Oh, goodness. It was a good mix. The Davis side especially was very good, especially with the Carlisle component of passing that on. And they wanted us to know, especially my great-grandma, Gabrielle, wanted us to know that her husband's father was Carlisle. And so when he died, she put that on his death certificate and wanted to make sure that that got passed down in the family. Because John Abraham did not like his father at all. He was mad at him and wanted nothing to do with him. Through 23andMe, we connected with Carlisle cousins, I should say, years ago through Ancestry.com, but then through 23andMe, we were able to confirm that, yeah, this story is true because we're all connected up on there. But a lot of family stories did get passed down. The Davises especially were very good at trying to document things and passing on the verbal stories. Some of them I found out because I had done a bunch of family research, wanting to know about my enslaved lines many, many years ago, like in my 20s. And people would say to me, hey, did you realize, like, you are a descendant of the Pearl? And that instant, I was like, the Pearl? What's the Pearl? I want to know. And so I started researching and finding out, and I talked to my dad about it, and he'd be like, oh yeah, like his aside, oh yeah, that happened. And I was like, well, thanks for telling me. But it was a mix. It was a mix of both.
Thank you.
One thing when we were researching this and putting together the images that was astounding was that you cannot find pictures of people of color back in the history before a certain date. And it was a miracle, I think it's like slide 8 or 9, that there was a photo of Millie, a slave, who has a photo taken, yes, right there on the left. I thought that was a miracle, and because it's rare. And then on the next slide down, or up, sorry, maybe it's 8, yep, the family tree. There are several people that did not escape the Pearl. None of them escaped the Pearl, but then they were sold down to New Orleans, and there's, I think it's Jonathan, right under all the circles, up in the second row. Yep.
John was one of them.
And it's the third one from the right. For example, he was sold and then there's nothing else known of him. So there's so many lives that just disappear and don't have any documentation. And I just think it's beautiful and powerful that you have so much family history documented to keep it going because of all the things that have trailed off and been lost in the process.
Well, and a big part of me being able to trace so many of my lines is the fact that, like, we know from Billy and from the Edmondsons, they got their freedom. That allowed them to be in censuses. Whereas there are parts of my lines that I still don't know their stories, and I assume maybe that is because of slavery, because they weren't in censuses. There weren't death certificates and birth certificates and things. They were treated as property. So whenever I run into a dead end, I'm like, okay, I'm guessing this is enslavement here.
What year was the Pearl? And I am curious, when you found news stories about it, like what was the tone of the news story? Like outrage at the people trying to escape, or?
I think it was 1848.
1848.
I can't.
It was 1848.
Yeah. The Pearl was 1848. News stories. I haven't read the actual news stories that were printed, but I do know there was a lot of outrage, and the Washington riots of, yeah, that's how I know 1848, because the Washington riots of 1848 happened, and they happened out of outrage for the people who were so upset, and they were mad at the abolitionists. And they actually went after, there was an abolitionist printer who released a newspaper, and they thought he was behind it. And they like wanted his head, and they were at his door and beating it down. He had nothing to do with it, but with the planning of it. But that was where kind of the riots started, was at his door. So they were mad.
This can you hear me? This story is so important to be told, and I could see even a college course curriculum based on this whole story, or even K through 12. Is anyone doing a documentary, or what's being done, a book, to get this story out there?
There is an old book on the Pearl, John Painter, I think. I don't think it's in print anymore, though. Some of Allison's story is told in cast. There's a chapter. I do have a cousin that works for Netflix, and they are developing cast. She's working on the project into a series at Netflix. And so I imagine she is Allison Jr.'s granddaughter, and so I imagine the story of her grandfather will be told in that. Other than the
But also the story being told through the physicality of what we see as a Caucasian female.
yeah,
When you identify as Black,
yeah,
but that's powerful.
yeah. Right now we have nothing. I have talked in the past about maybe someday I will write something. I know Allison Jr. has mentioned, he didn't tell me what he's writing, but he asked me for some family documents, because I am kind of the family historian on our side, and have documents of wills and things like that, because he mentioned he's putting something together, but I don't know what that is. But he also presents as Caucasian, because his mother, Allison's wife, her name was Elizabeth, presented as white, and he presents as white as well.
How does that make you feel presenting as white?
I'm sorry?
How does that make you feel presenting as white? Like, do you think about it a lot? Do you want more people to know that you're part, part of the black?
I'm very vocal about the fact that I'm biracial because, well, it's who I am. It's a big part of, if you know me and understand me, you have to understand that I'm biracial and my experiences related to that. And I own who I am. I don't know, I guess it's a complex question for me, because I grew up in a family where my dad, I mean, you saw pictures of him. He's been in Arizona. People have thought he's Latino. People have thought he's like South Asian Indian. Some people can tell he's black. My sister, she looks Afro-Latina to some. She was often thought to be Puerto Rican growing up. And we had experiences as a family that I won't get into right now, but were based in racism. And we grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona, which back then the only people of color were the ranch hands. Scottsdale was very different than it is today. It was all white except for ranch workers. That's about it. So any kids that were at my school were typically from Mexico and their families. And I didn't really have anybody to identify with, but race has been such a big part of my family my whole life. Like, I always knew that I was mixed race. One of my first memories in school was in kindergarten. I made this friend, his name was Alex, and he was tan, and I remember thinking, hey, maybe he's like me. Maybe his family is like mine, just because the kid was tan. And I didn't grow up around that. But, I mean, my grandfather is who my grandfather was. My dad looks the way he does. My sister looked the way she does. She was getting called the N-word on the bus. Like, it was a very complex, I guess, thing, being a mixed race family in a very white area for me. So, yeah, it's complicated, mixed, weird feelings. I don't know if it's presenting as white, but I think more just being mixed is complicated. And it's complicated for my sister. I mean, she presents as black, but she had a black boyfriend at one point, and the girls around him would be like, why are you dating that white girl? And like, all of us were like, in my family, like, you called her a white girl? Like, I get calling me a white girl, but calling her, colorism is complicated situation. It's
Crazy, because you would probably never get racism in this room, whereas you might, just because of what people see, it's too bad, they see with their eyes and it's gone.
I get more microaggressions is more of my stuff, or experiencing things through my family. My experiences will not be like Ninkosi's, I imagine. Just based off of what my father's experiences and my sister's experiences have been compared to mine. But, when my husband and I were engaged, a family member said, are you sure you want to marry her? You could have black kids. And I had boyfriends growing up who they thought it was cool, but why should it matter? I mean, they're ex-boyfriends for a reason. But they'd be like, hey, if we got married, we could have black kids someday, because look at your sister and look at your dad. Like, that's why when Meghan Markle was on TV on Oprah and she made that comment, I believed everything she said, because I was like, yeah, that's been my experience, and I'm lighter than you. So, hi, baby. Would you like to ask a question?
No, I'd like to ask a question.
Do you want the microphone?
It's like, can I
I want
have
to
a
talk
seat?
into the microphone.
Mic drop.
Oh, God.
He's been drawing these pictures the entire time. I think it's his way of showing appreciation.
Guys, hey Mom,
Yeah.
these are pictures for you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate your artwork. Thank you. All right, why don't you hand the microphone back, sweetie? He's got power in his hand right now, and he intends to use it.
Power the microphone. Yeah, we'll get ready to close it up. So we thank you again, for coming out. This kind of brings me back, full circle with our council. Because I was thinking our very first Let's Talk, we were talking about the book from Ibrahim X. Kendi, and it was non-racist versus anti-racist. And, the premise of the book was saying that, with all the inequity perhaps that we see based on color, you're saying it's not because there's a lack of ability, by people of color. It's not because there's a lack of intelligence of people of color. It's not because there's a lack of desire to be better by people of color. But as we are able to see, through this presentation, is that there have been laws enacted, laws in place, politicians all the way. So from, a local office up to the president, and this is what is, I guess you say visible in that sense, what we're able to talk about. And so that's the point, that, where I guess we're trying to advance to. It's not to be able to say that, well, I'm not racist anymore. So now the point of action, the point of movement, that point of evolution now is getting to the point of saying, I'm against racism, right? And then being able to utilize platforms, being able to utilize access, utilize, just your station in life, who you're connected with, to be able to understand that point of being able perhaps to open up doors, to have conversation, to open up perhaps minds with other people who in other ways would not be in contact with anyone to have such a conversation. And so there becomes that shared responsibility. You talk about the Underground Railroad, talking about shared responsibility, talking about civil disobedience, right? That was the civil rights movement before the civil rights movement. People risking home, people risking their lives, right? Jail time, whatever it may be, in the pursuit of freedom for those who are enslaved and desired to be free. And we're willing to risk absolutely everything, leaving family behind, whatever it may take to be able to obtain freedom. But these are examples that we see in the presentation of what it looks like to be anti-racist, to be against racism, and what are we willing to risk, what are we willing to sacrifice to allow things, to be better, for all people. And that's I hope the direction, that we are continuing to be able to move in. And so this is a opportunity, just from this discussion, and hopefully to understand, factual component, historical component, but the kind of that part of let's talk, but then beyond let's talk, let's move, right? Let's move. And how can we be able to move forward, to be a disruptor, right? John Lewis, to be good trouble, right? How can we move in that direction? Because it's not, I hope, a burden or a vehicle to be driven, just by, any one group of people. And as we see, and as we heard, and as we've been able to, to intake that, there's a potential to make a lot of change. As we see what happens through education, we see what happens when given a position to move forward using law, taking pictures with Thurgood Marshall, being involved in Brown v. Board. What happens when you have people, I guess the word is, are woke, right? When people who have that type of understanding are in positions and have that ability. And so that's kind of where we hope to move to, right? To be able to move forward, not to look, I'll tell you firsthand, and I tell you, being a part of this, council, being a part of this group, how it has helped me. because I was presented, with the opportunity, okay, can you kind of be like the MC for this night? And I want you to meet Cassie. I met Cassie via Zoom Monday night. Do you think this is what I was expecting to see?
I don't think anybody was
Yeah,
expecting it.
and it's always like, whoa, and I'm telling you, it's my biases, and it's there. We all have them. But then after talking, and sharing and vibing a little bit, we're like, okay, and we were able to, converse. Nicole was there as well. But that sometimes you get past, the exterior, and it takes a moment, it takes conversation, it takes time, it takes a willingness, right? It takes vulnerability, right? It takes honesty. It takes an awful lot for us to become better people. And that's exactly what it does take. And so that's what we're here about. This is what the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council is about. I hope that's what you're here for, to learn and be able to take this and be like, I don't know, obviously, what you do in that sense, but who you're able to talk to, but use a platform. Use it, and then be able to maybe make things a point of view, a perspective. I know it is difficult, having a perspective, an opinion that's different, perhaps, than a majority group. It's hard, and it's hard to express it. Sometimes it takes a lot of bravery, it takes a lot of courage, but that's what this is all about. It's about bravery, it's about courage, it's about resilience, it's about the greatest human qualities that we possess. And how do we have the strength to demonstrate what really makes us great as people? And that's what we're all striving to do, I hope, to be able to move forward. So again, on behalf of the Simsbury Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, we say thank you. Thank you for the Simsbury Public Library for allowing this space this evening. Thank you for Cassie for sharing tonight. So let's give her a round of applause. SCTV. So tell some people, and maybe not just tell them that it's on, sit down with them and make sure they watch it, and have it. And then maybe have a bit of a conversation afterwards, and that's what it's going to take. It takes a little bit of time, but for matters of this grave importance, then perhaps if all we have to do is sacrifice time, when so many have sacrificed so much, we're really not being asked to do all that much, if that's what we're really being asked to sacrifice. So, and we thank you for coming out. We hope you enjoyed yourselves. I hope you're able to learn, and based on some of the commentary and questions, we can understand, we see that it's hit home. So use it, let's be motivated. Let's move forward with it, and continue to hopefully open doors. Have conversation with other people that are sometimes uncomfortable, but that's the only way we grow. Can't grow without resistance.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.